Welcome to episode 2023. Have you ever wished you were more lucky? Have you ever wished that the luck of the Irish would be with you? Well, you can manufacture your own luck to an extent. There are definitely some things we can do to help ourselves become more lucky. And you may have heard the episodes, but I had Mark Manson, the author, on the show a few times over the years. And in his newsletter, he had this little interesting tidbit on how to be more lucky. One thing for you to think about: luck doesn't just happen, it's created. You can do things to increase the odds of serendipity. Meeting more people makes you lucky. Folks, I've said it many times, right? Your network is your net worth, and you've got to put yourself around like-minded people. Join the Empowered Investor Pro group, join our collective mastermind group, whatever. Go to our conferences, our live conferences, our virtual conferences. Meet more people, people that are doing what you want to do. Don't just let your friends happen by default. That's the way we go through life. Our friendships and associations just kind of usually happen by default. You've got to be strategic about that. You've got to pick them. You've got to act with more intent about friendships, right? So meeting more people makes you lucky. Learning more skills makes you lucky. Being willing to fail makes you lucky. And offering help to others makes you lucky. So that is all true. And I think that is great advice. There's one more thing I would add to it, and it is be in the game. You aren't ever going to get lucky if you're not in the game. And the extent to which you are in the game determines the extent to which you could become lucky, quote unquote. One of my early mentors at age 17 that changed my life, Earl Nightingale, he used to say on his audio cassette tapes that I would listen to over and over again until they were worn out. I highly recommend you look up Earl Nightingale, and, very old school, but brilliant stuff. And he would say, luck is what happens when preparedness meets opportunity. Luck is what happens when preparedness meets opportunity. And that is so true. Yes, there is definitely something, well, at least I believe in it. There is something called luck. Certain people have certain circumstances. Some of us have advantages. Some of us have disadvantages. All of us have a mix of both of those things. But one thing is for sure: if you are not in the game, you cannot be lucky. Like those lottery commercials say, which I don't recommend you play the lottery because the odds are absolutely terrible. But the point is true, right? And by the way, it's interesting because this is an example of taking valid logic and a valid point and extending it to a point where it makes no sense at all, right? So don't be fooled by that bias, right? But, what they say is true, right? You can't win if you don't play, right? That's true, right? You can't win if you don't play. But that isn't good advice for gambling, right? Gambling is a loser's game the vast majority of the time because the house always wins. And with the lottery or with any kind of gambling, you're pretty much going to lose, right? But the point is that you got to be in the game. And that's certainly true with real estate. I mean, during the beginning of 2020 into the middle of 2020, we had this massive health scare going on around the world, right? And everybody was saying, oh, the real estate market is going to crash. I'm so glad I have some cash so that when the crash happens, I can buy up properties like crazy. And guess what? All those people sitting on the sidelines, they completely missed the massive real estate boom that came after that, right? They totally missed out because they weren't in the game. And that happens over and over again. You just got to be in the game, right? You got to take a risk. You got to be willing to fail. You got to be in the game. Okay, but do that prudently, of course. And so our next collective mastermind event is coming up in beautiful Park City, Utah at the beginning of August, first weekend of August. Go to the Collective Mastermind for more details on that, or reach out to one of our investment counselors. Yes, if you're watching on video, that picture you see is me holding a selfie stick at one of our collective events. Okay, so Talk about being in the game and being lucky, right? Are you as amazed as I am at how incredible resiliency of the real estate asset has been? I am just dumbfounded. I'm so amazed at it, right? Because looking at this chart from Visual Capitalist shows you the different big rate hikes, big interest rate hikes, throughout the last 35 years. And you can see here that the most recent one was the most extreme, where almost a 5% increase. That is just a massive, massive increase compared to a couple of other cycles, right? 1994 and 1995, only about 2.6%. 99 to 2000, about 1.5%. 2015 to 2018, about 2%. 2004 to 2006, leading up to the Great Recession, right? 3.96%. So we can see we've had the absolutely most unbelievably treacherous rate hikes. I mean, just maybe ever in history, but certainly in the last 35 years. And home prices are holding pretty darn steady. Overall, depending on which survey you look at, of course, they're down 0.9%. That's it. Yeah, I know. Where's the crash, right? Where's the crash? But look at this. Here's an opportunity for you, okay? Check this out. So this is the 30-year mortgage interest rate on this chart compared to the monthly payment on the median price home. And of course, when you raise interest rates and you already have had a market where prices have accelerated or appreciated quite a bit, you are going to have a big differential where housing affordability goes way, way down. And all of those one-dimensional thinkers out there, all of those people who don't get it, all of those people who are looking at the one-dimensional aspect of income property, which is price. Is the price up, down, sideways, right? Well, down a whopping 0.9%. Oh my God, that's a crash. I'm so freaked out. But even if prices go down more, right? What does that do? It keeps renters out of the market. All those would-be home buyers aren't going to buy a house, right? Because they either can't afford it, that's usually the reason, right? Or they're concerned about prices declining and they're just not going to buy, right? They're going to choose not to buy, even if they could afford to buy. So that increases the size of the renter pool and pushes upward pressure on rents. And look at these home prices. They have reached record highs in most markets. So the nominal price and the inflation adjusted real price, of course, there is a difference in those two, but overall, record highs. Now, if you want to take deeper dives into this and how monetary policy and fiscal policy are going to affect your future as an investor, join us for our upcoming virtual event. These are super easy to attend. Couple hours on a Friday evening or afternoon, depending on your time zone, and then Saturday morning, afternoon, depending on your time zone. Again, I'm talking in Eastern time because I'm an Eastern time zone person. This virtual event is the first time ever we have done Creating Wealth. This is my oldest event, my core teaching, the event the most people have ever been through. Thousands and thousands of people have been through this event over the last 18 years. And it is definitely my magnum opus event. But of course, I do adapt it and modify it over the years based on what's going on in the world and the marketplace. And so this is coming up July 21st and 22nd. We've had some hiccups with our landing pages and our technology and yada, yada, yada. And so we have not promoted this event very well. I hate to admit that, but it's just true. So it's going to be a nice, intimate event where you'll get a chance to answer questions. Some of our virtual events, we have like 200 people, right? This is probably destined to be quite a bit smaller than that, which gives you more individualized attention. So join us for that. Just go to jasonhartman.com and join us for our upcoming virtual event. Super easy, jump on Zoom, and I think you'll really enjoy that and you will learn a lot from it. And you'll have some sort of virtual networking opportunities from it as well. So join us for that. jasonhartman.com to register. It's coming up quick, July 21st and 22nd, Friday and Saturday. Creating wealth, real people, real properties, real profits. Be sure to join us for that. Okay, let's get to our guest today. We have got a great guest. I met this guy on a trip to Ecuador. Young kid. His name is Malcolm, very successful author with multiple books, interviewed on big media outlets, BBC, many others. And he is the author of the Pragmatist Guide series. So let's dive into a very interesting interview with him. Here we go. It is my pleasure to welcome Malcolm Collins to the show. He is a former venture capitalist, a current private equity investor, and he is the author of the Pragmatist Guide series that includes 5 books, a guide to life, relationships, governance, and more. And today we are going to talk about a variety of topics, not the least of which is the economic impact of demographic decline. We're going to talk about that as it relates to the US, China, and the world in general, as well as a whole host of other things. I met Malcolm in Ecuador just a couple of weeks ago, and it was a real pleasure having some very nerdy conversations with him. So glad to have him on the show. Malcolm, welcome. How are you?
It is so great to be here today. You know, and this is an issue. We mentioned my VC background and the demographic stuff. So I was actually a director of strategy at a early stage VC firm in South Korea, actually the number one early stage firm there at the time. And I had this moment there where, you know, in VC, and a lot of people, they ask, why are all the Silicon Valley people so interested in demographic decline, but like the Wall Street people aren't? And it's because the VC people need to plot 50, 100 years out, whereas the Wall Street people are typically planning 5, 10 years out, right? But sometimes you can make very good bets when you have this longer 50-year time horizon and you see things before other people do.
Sure.
And when I was working in South Korea, I had to plot the future of the economy. Well, the problem is, if you look at their current fertility rate, which is dropping every year.
You're talking about South Korea now, right?
Yeah, South Korea.
Which has the lowest fertility rate on Earth. It's absolutely extinction collapse forever.
Let's assume it doesn't keep dropping. It stays where it is, right? So that means for every 100 Koreans, there will be 6.4 great-grandchildren. So we're looking at like a 94% population collapse by the end of the century. And we had people freaking out about like 1% of people dying in COVID and stuff like that. And nobody cares. And so I went to the other partners at my firm. And I said, well, what's going on? How do we, there isn't going to be an economy in 50 years. Like, what are we talking about? What are we investing in? And what they said basically was, well, we just sort of all pretend that everything's fine because the A round investors are pretending everything's fine and the B round investors are pretending everything is fine. And that's very much the way an economic collapse works before it happens, is that everybody is pretending that everything's fine because everyone else is pretending that everything's fine, but everybody secretly knows things are very, very not fine.
Right.
When I came back to the US, it was like traveling back in time 25 years, because we are today around where South Korea was in the late 90s. And we are looking at a similar trend. In fact, if the fertility rate in the US continues to decline at the rate it has over the past 10 years, for every 100 Americans, there will be only 3.4 great-grandchildren.
So wait. That can't be worse than South Korea, though.
So remember, the statistic for Korea was that if it doesn't decline any further. In America, the statistic I just gave is if the rate of decline continues at the rate it's going at now.
So you're talking about rate of decline rather than current rates projected forward for the US.
Yes. So for the
South Korea, you did it differently.
So South Korea, what I did is I said, suppose their fertility rate stays constant.
You gave them the benefit of the doubt, in other words.
Yeah. Right. In the US, we're fine if fertility rate stays constant. Okay. The problem being that not a single country on Earth has figured out how to reverse this trend. Hungary spent 5% of its GDP last year trying to reverse the trend. They only got fertility rates up by 1.6%.
Wow.
And this is, and that is like an irrelevant number. When we were talking about how screwed China is, A lot of people underestimate. So they hear China and they go, oh, this is all about China's one-child policy. That's why they have a low fertility rate. And it's like, no, something new, something catastrophic is happening. In 2020, their fertility rate fell by 20%. In 2021, it fell by 13%. Double-digit rates of decline are insane. You think, oh, this is just zero COVID. 2022, it's going to go back up. 2022, it did go back up, 0.18%. Fortunately, the US is in a little more protected state than other countries, but the big problem is, and this is where it all comes back to investing, and it's something that investors are going to be able to understand, which the general public just can't get when I talk to them often. It's that our entire economic system is built on the presumption of constant growth. Real estate goes up because demand for real estate goes up, because there's more people and those people have more money. Let's just talk about real estate. Real estate right now is actually going up because demography is declining. And that can often surprise people. They're like, what do you mean by that? What's happening is that family units are atomizing. So you used to have a family where you would have a husband and a wife and 3 kids living in one house. But now, even though the population isn't continuing to go up at the rate it used to go in, people aren't getting married anymore. They're living in different houses. So this means you need more of these starter homes, which is causing the current pressures on the market. However, these pressures are inherently unsustainable. They are the sign of a coming mega collapse. And when I say a mega collapse, what I mean is for 300 years, the economy on average has always gone up. And it's always gone up because the number of people in the economic system has been rising exponentially, but the productivity per person has been rising linearly. Yes, technology has been increasing exponentially, but if you look at the productivity per worker, and you can find graphs of this is pretty much a linear increase. If population begins to decline exponentially within developed countries, now people say, oh, the developing world still has a lot of people, but the developing world isn't relevant in the world economy. You know, the countries that are the ones that are collapsing are the ones where that matter economically in the world. So if that starts to decline, then we could see a stock market that every year is declining on average. And when that happens, this is where debt comes into play. And this is when I talk with investors and they get it and other people don't. Debt's a miraculous tool. You know, if I am buying a property or I am making an investment as a private equity guy and I'm making a $10 investment and $8 of that is debt and $2 of that is equity, and that investment goes up by just 20%, I've doubled my equity investment. But if it goes down by just 10%, I've lost half my equity investment. Right. We haven't just taken out debt at the level of our nation state. We've taken out debt at the level of our cities, at the level of our states, at the level of our businesses, at the level of our land, at the level of our human capital. It is insane how leveraged our economy is. And that has led to a false prosperity that will immediately disappear if anything ever begins to decline in the aggregate.
Couldn't agree more. And, you know, that really started in earnest around the late 60s, early 70s. You know, we had I believe the first major credit card was the Diners Club card. And then this whole expansion of credit, then we went off the gold standard in 71 and the government just could spend with no tether whatsoever. It is a false prosperity, but let's actually just dissect that a bit. And I want to go back to some of your other points earlier too, but it's not entirely false, the prosperity, right? Because like you said, debt is a tremendously powerful tool. It allows you to basically borrow from the future to get progress today, right? Mm-hmm. And so as long as you have an economic machine that's big enough to pay for the idea is if you can borrow from the future, but the machine that you're financing is so powerful that it can pay back way more than what you borrowed from the future, it's worth it. And that's why on an individual level for real estate investors, debt is a phenomenal tool, yes. Right? But it's not always going to be that way. When we hit 2050, maybe a little before, a little bit after, things are going to shift pretty radically because of the demand equation. You know, we certainly saw that with Japan, right? Everybody in the late 80s was very xenophobic about Japan. They thought Japan was going to take over the world. They had their collapse and they're still getting through it. But you can't have a country if you don't have children. You can't have an economy if you don't have children. People are the demand side of the equation, but they're also the supply side of the equation too, right? So they're just vitally important. We could go down a rabbit hole of artificial intelligence and technology, and I might want to do that with you. But first, I want to go back to something you talked about much earlier, and that is the cause. I think we can't just say, well, there's a demographic decline, which there is. The numbers do not lie. But let's examine why that is happening, the sociological forces that are causing that decline. I mean, Hungary, it spends 5% of its GDP, can't get people to have sex. The US can't get people to do it. The only way the US is growing is through immigration in any real way, right? You look at Western Europe, you look at Russia, you look at Japan, you look at China. I mean, these are demographic cliffs. They are catastrophic. What are some of the causes? And there are many, but let's touch on a few.
Yeah. So, I mean, we could talk about, this is an area I could go deep and crazy on, but if we talk about like this social virus, this sort of progressive monoculture in our society that's sort of, I call it the urban monoculture because it exists across communities, pretty much anywhere urban center you go in the world, it's spreading from there. It leads to very low fertility rates. But instead of getting political, let's talk about the economics of this, because this is actually, I think, really interesting. A lot of people think that people aren't having kids because they don't have enough money. But the reality is that the less money you have, the more kids you have.
And in the past, you had way less money and you had more kids.
Yes.
So that's not a reason.
So poorer countries have more kids, and poorer people within a country have more kids until you get to the very extreme of the economic spectrum. So in the US, you don't give an above repopulation rate again. That means that people are replacing themselves until a family is earning on average $500,000 a year. And if you look at the world, on average, a country falls below repopulation rate. So a lot of people are like, oh, it's like a developed world and a non-developed world thing, but that's really not right. If you look at Central and South America, right, they fell collectively below repopulation rate by the UN's own statistics in 2019. So it's only really poor countries. So to be above repopulation rate today, a country really needs to have, on average, the average citizen needs to earn less than 5,000 USD a year. So what's happening here? Why is it that the very rich and the very poor are the ones who are least affected by this? And the answer is that one of the core economic things causing this is actually engagement with a market-based economy. Now, I'm a capitalist as much as anyone could be. But we have to admit that to an extent, this is somewhat caused by capitalism, in that capitalism is a great system for dynamically judging the value of a person and paying them just what it needs to pay them to get them to spend their time doing something that the system sees as productive versus something else. The problem is that the system isn't good at judging long-term value from stuff like adding humans to the system, like kids to the system. So if you have a smart, well-educated person, right, who can command a high salary, that high salary that they are quote unquote commanding is actually the system, what the system needs to pay to bribe them to not have a life. And that life in the past was marriage, kids, everything like that. And the more the system wants somebody, the more it's peeling them out. And this is also why, people are always talking like, okay, well, people with lower IQs are having more kids than people with higher IQs. This is because the people with higher IQs are more in demand by the system. They have more value to the system, so the system will pay them more to not spend their time on their family.
So I think the other thing, though, is one of the really good measures of IQ is foresight, I think. Mm-hmm. Being able to determine what is the likely thing that is going to happen if you take a certain action today. And so you could argue that people with higher IQs just have more foresight and they understand the future impact of today's decisions, right? They're willing to delay gratification for a bigger long-term future. And I think you could also argue that they're more selfish. Selfish is a complex topic, okay? And by the way, I want to recommend the book by Ayn Rand, The Virtue of Selfishness, which the title has very little to do with the book. In fact, in the intro, she says that she titled it that just to bother people. I love that. But anyway, you could argue that it's selfish to have children because you're getting all kinds of joy out of that and you're ignoring other things, right? Or you could argue that it's selfish not to have kids because you just want to like do your own thing. Right. So I don't know, those arguments can go both
I'd
ways.
say it's interesting. It depends on how you define your life goals. I don't know if you've seen the meme where you have sort of the low end and then the midwits and then the high end people again. And so I think a lot of these people who are drawn into the university system and stuff like that, they get the urban monoculture tells people the only thing that matters in life is your own happiness. Whereas a lot of people who haven't been drawn in and sort of brainwashed to an extent by this monoculture, they believe that what matters is their culture, having kids, giving those kids a good life. And yet when people in this urban monoculture think about kids, what they're asking is, how do these kids improve their own life? So I think what you have with people at the two ends of the spectrum, you have your Elons, and then you have your people who aren't going to college, and both of them realize a fundamental truth, I think, which is that in reality, a life well lived is a life where you are passing something down to future generations, where you have a satisfying family life, you have kids, you are continuing your cultural traditions. And so much of us have forgotten the value of those things.
Well, the lefty media and just the lefty narrative will convince people that that's wrong and that kids are bad for the environment and people are a cost, not a resource. People are a cost, but they tend to also pay for themselves. It's both. And by the way, a great book that I've recommended many times before on the show is called The Bet. And it's about Ehrlich and Simon and this big debate in the 70s over the environment. That there was the Malthusian ideal that, we're going to run out of resources. And they literally said it. People have to stop effing, have to stop having kids. We've got to stop these people from breeding. Like that was the Malthusian idea, right, of scarcity. And then the other idea was, that people are a resource. They create abundance. They create solutions. They solve problems. And that's the side I'm on. I like people. I think they're great. I think the next person born could be the person who cures cancer and helps us colonize the universe. Who knows? It's just really unfair. And Mark Stein made an interesting comparison to this idea of the avatar of a feminist left-leaning woman, right? Who's in her mid-30s, who doesn't want to have children because she thinks children are bad for the environment. And she thinks that's really like selfish to have kids, okay, of people to do that. But interestingly, when she gets older, will be a 100% burden on the economic system because there will be no one to take care of her, no one to pay into the system. She will simply be a burden and the government will have to take care of her because there's no kids. And it doesn't understand. It could be her kids taking care of her. That's the one-dimensional way to think of it, of course. But really, it's kids in general that are the next workers that pay into the pension system. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's why China will collapse very soon because China is a demographic disaster. Okay. There's simply no children to support the older retiring workers.
So one of the things I find so hypocritical is this hypothetical progressive woman who you mentioned. When I go talk to her about this, well, you're going to be living off the system, right? Isn't that fundamentally selfish? She's like, no, we can fix this with immigration. And then I point out, I'm like, well, Latin America fell below repopulation rate, 3 years ago, right? And they go, oh no, we can fix this with immigration from Africa. And it's like, so is your actual, like, not racist plan to import people from Africa to pay for a bunch of non-working white people who decided not to put in the effort to have kids themselves?
Sounds like slavery to me.
It's obviously a much more ethical sin, but than slavery, but it is still unethical. It is. And worse, it creates a system where the developed world's economy is completely reliant on African countries staying poor to maintain this high fertility rate, because no one, and people should be focused on this, no one has figured out, except for Israel, and we can get on that later, has figured out how to combine prosperity, gender equality, and education with anything like a stable population. But, and this is something we haven't talked about that I know some of your readers are shouting at the screen, even if all of these things weren't problems, we still have the problem that dating markets are completely broken right now.
Okay, let's talk about that one because I couldn't agree more. It's amazing to me. Like, I remember being razzed a few months ago about a couple who has been married forever. You know, they're lucky they found their sweetheart very early in life. They've been married for a long, long time. And they said, Jason, you know, when are you going to marry? Are you just going to be a bachelor forever? And as if I want that, right? Like as if I have a choice. Their whole perception of life is literally 4 decades old. And they have no concept of how much it has changed, even in the past decade. It has just radically changed. Like, think about it. If someone has that reference point of 4 decades ago, they're literally 2 generations out of step. You know?
I couldn't agree more. And
not to mention the massive impact of technology. I mean,
yeah. Oh, so there was a tweet I saw recently that I really agree with, which is being, you know, a younger person in a happy relationship, like happy marriage today feels like catching the last chopper out of Nam.
Yeah.
It is
out of Vietnam, yes.
Yeah, Vietnam. You know, you're like, oh God, like the rest of those people are really screwed. I am lucky to have gotten on this because I don't know. You know, I met my wife.
The problem is, though, with that metaphor you just mentioned. So being in a good relationship today is like catching the last helicopter out of Vietnam being evacuated, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that helicopter, the metaphorical helicopter, is being shot at constantly because there are so many forces in social media, the media in general. When I say media, I don't just mean the news, right? I'm talking about movies, books, TV, everything, music, especially. The whole drift of society is breed discontent, ruin relationships, cheat, have fun, live for today, have the hookup culture. It's just absolutely disgusting. It's a total mess. People have to realize that what has happened since the sexual revolution in the 60s never happened before in history for thousands or millions of years, right? This is a totally new experiment. It has never happened. There is literally no evidence to support the culture we have today. That there's no evidence to say that this works.
Well, okay. So 2 things. One is you're talking about this being a new culture. You're talking about debt being actually kind of a new thing used in the way we use it today. A lot of people have this perception that like, oh, society will just go on. It's gone on for a long time. You know, not a lot has changed. It's been all incremental changes. It's like, no, there's a bunch of new experiments we're playing out. But you saying we've never tried this before. No, we've tried this before. The same thing happened near the end of Athens. The same thing happened near the end of Rome. Sexual revolution, rise in gender equality, all of this. Yeah. This rigmarole happens every time we're at the top of a cycle. I would like to be able to create an infinite top of a cycle. I actually think it's good to have, you know, gender equality and sexual freedom. And it'd be cool if we could find a way to do that without society collapsing. But finding that means we need to consciously think about what's about to happen and experiment with it. So remember when I said that this was a marketplace failure? Dating is a marketplace failure. It is a real marketplace. So people, you know, they sometimes are like, oh, you mean like metaphorically? No, you have people, men and women on 2 sides of a marketplace, basically trading themselves for someone they think is of equal value.